PowerPoint slide here, and it's this person here standing maybe in the middle of the road, not sure. It is in the desert and somewhere. I mean, it's a little ambiguous, but nevertheless, this person is standing here. And this person is able to see and smell and taste and has all of his senses. And particularly, we're interested, can this person hear? So not far behind this person is this, not too far, but standing back behind him is this person standing there a certain distance back. And he's going to greet him. He's going to say hello, or he's going to say hi. And now the question becomes, all right, what happens here? What is the person going to do? You know, obviously the person's going to hear, hopefully. How does the message get to the person in terms of the auditory signal? Well, it happens through sound waves. It's this force that kind of moves air particles through the air. It forces air particles to move, and it vibrates and moves against the surface here, and in a way makes certain parts of our body vibrate, at least within our ear, that will eventually go to the process of transduction that produces sound. Well, anyway, we have this person here who says hi. And what happens next? Well, the person says hi, and the sound waves hit the person's ears. Now, if this person is right behind, directly behind, not to the left, not to the right, what you're going to see here is roughly, as I'm trying to convey here, this represents sound waves that are going to hit both the left and the right ears. Now, let me ask you, which ear is hit first? In other words, which ear does it hit first? Is it the one on the left, the one on the right, or is it the same? I'll start with that question first. Does it hit the left ear first, the right ear first, or does it roughly the same? What would you say? Based upon the picture you see here, you know, the red lines hitting the ear, supposing it's the speed of sound, does it hit the left ear first, the right ear first, or the same? What do you think? I'll give you a moment to think about that. Okay. So now, first of all, I should say that this is not the best drawn picture, because if you're looking for the nuances here, then you might be correct in saying left or right. It's supposed to be, as T. Sizzle suggests here, if the person's directly behind, then the sound waves, if it's coming directly behind me, should hit both ears roughly at the same time. So my brain picks up on that the left ear and the right ear heard it at roughly the same time. Now, why is that relevant? Well, let's say another person comes into the picture here, like this. And the person, again, is very friendly, like the other person, says hello. Well, now the question becomes, again, we have sound waves. Which ear is going to be hit first? Now, we're looking at him, so our left is his right, and our right is his left. Which ear do you think the sound waves, for this guy here on the side of the screen here, which ear do you think it's going to hit first in terms of the sound waves? The sound waves are going to travel, okay? It is going to hit, certainly, his right ear first. Now, the timing, it's such a close call. I mean, it's really, really close, but in actuality, it's going to hit the left ear. I'm sorry, you're correct, his right ear first. My left, his right. It's going to hit his right ear first, just slightly, maybe by a split second, but it's going to hit his right ear first and then his left ear. And you see, this is important because the brain calculates, it does a miraculous calculation in which it determines, okay, the person A, the first person, the ears hit my ears around the same time. Interesting. And then the other person, it hit my right ear first and then my left ear. Well, I might conclude then, based on that, because it hit this ear first, that the person must be, in this instance, to my right, and if you're looking at me, I guess it's your left, unless my image is switched. But basically, that's the idea. And this is the concept of sound localization. The idea of how do we localize sound, in other words, how do we identify the direction of the sound? It depends on how it hits our ears. It depends on the timing of the ears. If it's directly to my right, okay, this is my right ear. If the sound hits, if it's directly to my right, it's going to hit my right ear first and then my left, and there's going to be a certain delay. If it's slightly off to my right, it will still hit my right ear first, but the timing is not quite as much. The timing, or just the delay, isn't quite as much. So there's less of a delay, hits right ear, hits left ear, the delay is less, and that tells me that the sound is probably over here as opposed to over here. And again, I'm kind of being a little technical with it, or a little I'm kind of really going into detail about this, really kind of overkilling the point perhaps. It did appear on an AP exam once upon a time. So it just an idea about how sound localization works. It's the timing of the ears, and that's important to understand there. Now, a second concept going into the psychology of hearing, elements of sound. And when we talk about elements of sound, we talk about sound waves, obviously. Now, not all sounds are the same. My voice has a certain sound. If you were to speak, your voice would have a different sound. Sounds from different instruments, musical instruments, are going to sound different. The sound of a robin versus the sound of an eagle is going to be different. We have so many different types of sounds. Well, what makes up these sounds? Like, what are the elements of sound? And for our purposes, we're going to stick to 3 elements here. The first one being the pitch. Okay, also referred to as the frequency. I don't have the word frequency. I should have put that word frequency in here. So I'm just going to make a note that pitch equals frequency. Right? Pitch equals frequency. In other words, if you were to look at the sound waves, how many of these little waves are there? Okay, and essentially it refers to look at the wrong thing here. Is it a high note, a low note? What note is it? Is it a C note, a D note? You learn about music class, different pitches, and it's the frequency. The more frequent the sound waves, the more frequent the waves, I don't have a visual of this other than me doing this with my finger here. The more frequent the sound waves, the higher the pitch, the higher the frequency. The higher the pitch, the higher it goes, okay? The lower the frequency, okay? The lower the frequency, the lower it goes, the lower the pitch. So that's the first part, pitch, which also refers to the frequency of the sound waves. How many sound waves are there? Now, another element to this is the amplitude. And amplitude is just a fancy way of saying how loud is something. If it has high amplitude, it's pretty loud. If it has low amplitude, it is going to be soft or pretty quiet. People who are in a band or are familiar with music know that sometimes you need an amplifier. What is an amplifier? Well, it makes your very small musical instrument project a lot of sound because it's amplifying. It's making it a much louder sound. So amplitude is the second part. The third part, and even though it doesn't look like it's pronounced like this, and actually I've heard several different types of ways of pronouncing this, timbre refers to the purity of the sound. Now, when I say purity, I'm not saying that one's pure, one's impure, but take, for example, a C note. If I asked you to play a C note, you might ask me, okay, C note on what? A piano? A C note on a violin? Do you want me to sing the C note? Or do you want someone else to sing the C note? And if it is, do you want someone who sings soprano to sing that C note, alto, baritone, bass? In other words, it's different types of sounds that can produce that that particular sound. So, for example, the C note of a saxophone is not the same as the C note of a piano, which is not the C note of a violin, which is not the C note same as a C note of someone who is singing. So we have to understand. When we talk about timbre, we're talking about essentially the purity. It's referred to the purity. What does that sound actually sound like? So pitch refers to frequency. Is it a high note? Is it a low note? Amplitude refers to the loudness of the sound, and then the timbre refers to the purity. And when I say purity, it doesn't mean one's impure. It just means different instruments produce different sounds. So that is the elements of sound. Again, if you have questions, feel free to ask in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer. So now, this is where it intimidates some people, and really should not. Different parts of the ear, and much like many other things we talk about here, it's really a matter of memorization. It's really a matter of knowing a part of the ear in this case and knowing what it does. And believe it or not, some of these, the ear, we kind of, in some ways, we undervalue the value of the ear. And you might say, how would you do that? We listen with our ears. We need our ears to hear. That's true. But it also does a number, I should say it has connections to other things, which we'll talk about a little later on. So the first thing here is the outer ear, which we're going to call here the pinna. The pinna is the outer layer of the ear. So if a person talks about having big ears or not big ears, you're actually talking about the outer ear, which is the pinna. The pinna, the job of the pinna, or the function of the pinna, is to collect sound. So if an animal has pinna that's very large like this, or it cups out like this, what this allows me to do is to collect more sound. Now, if you've never done this before, cup your ears like this and start talking, and you'll realize that the sound that you produce is much different. You might be able to hear yourself swallow, or maybe pick up on sounds you normally would not normally pick up on. And that's because, well, in this case, you're kind of enlarging your pinna here so it can collect more sound. So the pinna is the first part that collects the sound, takes the sound waves, collects them, which will lead to the next part of the ear, which is the ear canal. Really, that's nothing really too remarkable about it, other than the fact that sound travels down it, and that many people take a Q-tip and try to clean out the ear canal. Of course, if you look at the Q-tip packaging, it tells you do not put into your ears. It's not safe, but many people do it anyway. I'll just go with Q-tips and say don't do it. It's not safe. But anyway, so at the end of the ear canal is referred to as the eardrum, or sometimes referred to as the tympanic membrane. Essentially what happens here is that sound waves enter. Okay, remember that it's these sound waves, it's frequency, it's a pulsing sound, and it hits this eardrum. And the eardrum is going to basically vibrate, in a manner of speaking, relative to the speed of the frequency of the sound waves. And that is, like I said, you wouldn't want to think about it, because if you go in, your eardrums are at the end of your canal, you're not normally thinking about them vibrating, but in a very small, subtle way, they are going to actually do that. Well, as the eardrum is being stimulated by the sound waves, it actually starts this almost domino-like reaction. And what's weird about this is that the textbooks in psychology have names for this that are not going to be found in medical books. The names that we often use in this case for psych, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. And what actually happens here is that the eardrum basically gets vibrated, and then the eardrum hits the hammer, which hits the anvil, which hits the stirrup. Now, the higher the frequency of the pitch, assuming that it's going into the ear, the faster that eardrum hammer anvil stirrup combination is. Now, by the way, the hammer anvil and stirrup, they don't call that in the text in the medical books. They call it the malleus, the stapes. I forget what the third name is, but for psych, they use these names. So I'm just sticking with these names. But the higher the frequency, the higher this eardrum hammer anvil stirrup. Hammer, anvil, stirrup, hammer, anvil, stirrup. If it's a higher pitch, hammer, anvil, stirrup, hammer, anvil, stirrup, hammer, stirrup, and you get the idea. So the higher the frequency, the faster this thing kind of fires off, if you will. So it kind of follows sort of to the frequency of the pitch. Are these part of the middle ear? Yes. These are often referred to as the middle ear, the pinna being the outer ear. Hammer, anvil, and stirrup referred to as the middle ear sometimes. I've never seen that asked specifically in the AP exam, but it's still good to know. Refers to this middle ear. And these three things, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, actually it has a, we call these bones. They are actually bones, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. We call them the ossicles. The ossicles being the smallest bones in the human body, bones in your ears. So a person who in this middle ear has the ossicles, the hammer, anvil, stirrup, that's being activated by the eardrum being vibrated on by the frequency of the pitch, or the pitch of the sound, whatever it might be. People who have what's called conduction hearing loss. Conduction hearing loss is, think about the people who are in a band. Some famous musicians are talking about this now, that they've been listening to loud music, they're on stage, and they're hearing this loud music so much, so often, so loud, that now they're starting to have hearing loss, where they are unable to hear. Well, often it's the case that it's conduction hearing loss, where essentially the frequent, I don't use the word frequency and frequent here, but the often exposed loud sounds hitting the eardrum, hitting the hammer, anvil, and stirrup repeatedly and with such intensity damages the ossicles. And so what happens here is a person is unable to hear, at least not very well, because the hammer, anvil, and stirrup combination has been damaged. It's referred to as conduction hearing loss. So I know that on the AP exam they might have asked something like that before, but it's conduction hearing loss is when the bony structures, the ossicles, are damaged. So as we move on here, the next part is actually this windy looking thing, kind of looks like a snail. It's called the cochlea, and this is actually your inner ear. This is the third part of the ear. And the cochlea is this wound up coil that has these tiny little hairs in them that they're filled with liquid. The cochlea is filled with liquid, has these tiny little hairs. And so basically what happens is, if you're of a certain age, you might remember a waterbed, and a waterbed chamber would have like this long coil, sometimes filled with water. It's not a great analogy because, you know, you didn't grow up learning about waterbeds. But think about if I drop a pebble into a pond, into a still pond, and there's that ripple effect. We'll take that ripple effect and kind of put it down a narrow stream, or a narrow path of fluid, like a hose that you can kind of see through in this case. You can kind of see that moving through. Well, as it moves through, it stimulates the hair receptors within the cochlea that will basically create transduction of sound. Transduction meaning taking the sensory signals, the outside signals, and turning them, or transducing them, I'm not sure if that's the word, but going through transduction to create the neural signal that eventually goes to the brain. That's the cochlea. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And then the auditory nerve. So finally, after the cochlea does its thing, it sends that signal to the auditory nerve. The auditory nerve heads on its way to the brain, where it goes to the thalamus and then eventually to the temporal lobe. And it's going to be processed there. Well, okay, so you have here these different these functions here. So the pinna captures the sound, sends it to the ear canal. It vibrates against the sound, vibrates against the eardrum or the tympanic membrane, which basically fires up the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, which then hits the what's called the oval window of the cochlea, sending the ripple down the cochlea, moving hair cells that are going to create transduction, leading on the way to the auditory nerve, to the thalamus, and eventually the temporal lobe. So that's the basic idea, the very basic idea of how that works. Also, in the cochlea, some people have damage in the cochlea that also produces hearing loss. That's called sensorineural hearing loss. That's where there's actual damage in the cochlea, where a person might experience hearing loss because there's damage in the cochlea, as opposed to conduction hearing loss, which is loss of hearing due to the ossicles being damaged. So that right there is anatomy of, well, I'm sorry, not all the anatomy of the ear, but most of it. Two more things I want to talk about here. They are the Eustachian tube, which I may or may not be pronouncing correctly, but that's okay. There's no speaking test in the AP Psych exam. The Eustachian tube, you might know or might notice that some people, when they're in the plane, their ears start to pop, let's say. Their ears are popping because the pressure is changing. And what they might do is they might hold their nose and blow, trying to pop their ears. first, let me just say, don't do that. It's not safe. It is not a safe thing to do. But why do people do that? Because the eustachian tube connects to the nose. It actually connects to the nose, and that's why sometimes if you have a stuffy nose, you might have an earache because there's that connection between the two. There is that connection that can occur because the eustachian tube connects the nose, or the parts of the nose at least, to the ear. So there's that eustachian tube. Another thing is this thing up here. It's not great in this picture, but it's these three rings. So here's the cochlea is this coil thing, but the three rings kind of above it are called the semicircular canals. Now, the semicircular canals are not actually part of the hearing system, but it is part of the ear. The semicircular canals are part of your vestibular system. Your vestibular system helps you stay balanced. It helps you keep your balance. It helps you basically walk a straight line. So I remember, see if we remember from another class, the semicircular canals, if they help you keep balance, to which part of the brain do you think this would most likely connect to? Or would most likely connect? Which part of the brain do you think would most likely connect? If the semicircular canals, and this is obviously a review of bio, so if the semicircular canals are in charge of balance, what part of the brain, okay, T-Sizzle, great name by the way, T-Sizzle says cerebellum, okay, cerebellum, that's correct, because the cerebellum helps you stay in charge of your balance, okay? So as a result, signals that produced in the cerebellum, don't worry about the spelling, that would have been close enough to score on the FRQ if you wrote that. Basically the semicircular canals connect to that cerebellum, long story short, simplified, but that's the way it works. This is also why sometimes when people have hearing difficulties or if they have ear infections, sometimes they may have difficulty with balance because what's happening in the ear might affect the semicircular canals. So some people talk about how, well, let's put it this way. If a person turns and turns and turns and turns and turns and they get dizzy. Why are they getting dizzy? Because the semicircular canals, which are also filled with fluid, are being disrupted a bit. And so as a result, it's still shaking, as it were, and you're trying to kind of figure, oh my gosh, I'm dizzy, and eventually you get back to normal awareness, as it were. But you get dizzy because the semicircular canals are being jostled around. So that helps you keep balance. So understand the cochlea is this like coil-looking thing, whereas the semicircular canals are this like three-ring circus, as it were. Now let's look at the cochlea, this coiled thing. Let's open it up. Well, if I were to open it up, I mean, this is not the greatest depiction in the world, but it works for us. If I open it up, you're going to see it's this kind of tube in a way, or this kind of like a little, not rope, but this kind of connection of little hairs. Well, this whole long connection is called the basilar membrane. Again, I know you can't see my mouse, but this thing that kind of curves a little bit, goes up and down a little bit, with these little blue things. That whole thing is called the basilar membrane. And basically what happens here is that in the basilar membrane, there's these auditory cilia. Cilia is a fancy word for hairs, little hairs. And these blue lines represent the auditory cilia, the little blue hairs. And so what happens here is that as the oval window of the cochlea is stimulated, as the sound waves hit that oval window, it sends that little ripple, if you will, down the cochlea, moving the hairs along the basilar membrane, moving them, and it produces the sense of sound, or the experience of sound. So, and basilar membrane is one of those words that I kind of taught very, I touched upon it in the past. I'd say, yeah, basilar membrane, didn't really quiz anyone on it, or didn't really, emphasize it all that much. And then it appeared on the AP exam in 2017 on the FRQ, and it threw off a lot of students. So I, along with probably about 2,000 other psych teachers, really make sure to take the time to talk about the basilar membrane being in the cochlea that contains these little hairs that allow you to experience sound. The transduction of sound, when sound waves become neural signals that go to the brain. Okay, now here's where it gets kind of interesting. Why is it that we can experience sound? This is one of those things that was a controversy in the early days of psychology. How is it that we're able to hear sound? One theory of sound was called the place theory. Place theory suggested that, so in this slide here, you can see the ossicles represent the ossicles in the oval window. The beginning of the cochlea is to the far left here. And that different parts of the cochlea, different parts along the basilar membrane, correspond to different pitches. So at the very beginning of the cochlea, a high-pitched sound would hit hairs that were in that section of the cochlea, whereas a low pitch would correspond to a different part, a much later part in the cochlea, and then the medium pitches would be somewhere in the middle, and the arrow representing the direction of the wave, the way the wave is going here. So that was one theory. Now, the problem with that is that place theory just wasn't very good at trying to explain, I believe it was the low pitches. Place theory was not very good at, to explain why low pitches could occur. So then another theory was called frequency theory. And frequency theory, now this is not going to be, if I had all the time in the world, I'd make this a little bit more, a better animation on this. But basically, frequency theory suggested that the rate at which the hairs moved correspond to the frequency. So here I have this arrow moving the little hairs here at a certain rate. So basically, a lower pitch would move more slowly down the cochlea, stimulating the hairs in the basilar membrane, and it would move the hairs a certain frequency. When you get to higher pitches, it would move more quickly. Okay, so that because the higher pitches correspond to more waves, that means more of these traveling things that go by much more quickly, and that was the idea behind frequency theory. Problem with frequency theory is that, well, the hairs can only move so quickly. Long story short, they figured out the hairs could only move at a certain rate, like so quickly, and it couldn't quite explain high pitches. So we had one theory that could not explain low pitches, that was place theory, and we had one theory that couldn't explain high pitches, frequency theory. So what's the answer? Well, this is what I heard a great line about psychology not that long ago. There are two answers to everything in psychology. One is it depends, and the other one is both. And the answer to this question, which theory is correct? The answer is both. And this is what's referred to as the traveling wave theory, also known as the volley theory. Essentially, the idea here is that we have different receptor cells, different basilar membranes kind of lined up in the cochlea here. And as the signal travels down, basically different hairs are going to be stimulated in different different basilar membranes. They're going to be stimulated in different basilar membranes. So the ones in red indicate when a hair cell has been stimulated. So the third one here, that red one was moved there, and then in the fourth one, the second hair was moved, and basically, so you can kind of correspond to which hairs were being moved at a particular time, as a sound wave was traveling down. Well, what that does is that because each one can only move so much so often, but if you put them together and they take turns, they kind of volley the responsibility. And actually, it should be going more in a sequential order, but this is the idea. Basically, they kind of take turns moving a hair. What happens here is at the bottom, these red marks at the very bottom indicate stimulations of the auditory nerve. And so, in this case, when you put them all together, it's as if the hairs have been stimulated 24 times when essentially each particular membrane was only stimulated 8 times in this very oversimplified model, I might add. But when you put them all together, it seems like 24 total stimulations, which can very easily account for both, or this could very easily help us understand low pitch perception and high pitch perception. So that's the traveling wave theory. As far as I know, one of a well-accepted theory, although I could be wrong about that. So that really is the basics of the auditory system. This is mostly about the sensation, but also more about the sensation of the auditory systems. How do people hear color? So what you're talking about there is a phenomenon known as synesthesia. Synesthesia is where essentially the sensory modalities are mixed up, and where when people listen to sounds, they also see colors. That's one type of synesthesia. Another one is when a person has certain tastes, they start hearing certain sounds. That's where basically, if we think about the 5 senses, they get mixed up. And so when I touch something that's cold, I see red all of a sudden. Or if I feel something smooth and I taste something chocolatey, those are all forms of synesthesia. And it's kind of interesting if you know of people who have very, very strong types of synesthesia. And there's actually research to suggest that's kind of continuous synesthesia. Because if I said, for example, think about a high pitch being played. Okay, I think of a color. Okay, I play an imaginary piano here, and I'm gonna play a high pitch. Okay, actually I have a piano over there, but it'd be kind of hard to bring it over here. If I said think of a color, and then I'm gonna play a low pitch, think of a color. What you'll find is that many people, when it's a high pitch, will often give a light color, give like a pink or a white or a light blue. And then when it's a low pitch, it's often like a dark red, black, brown, dark purple, a darker color. And so it might be a synesthesia, might be kind of a continuum, but for the true, really overwhelming, where I'm listening to a sound, I'm tasting things, or I'm eating certain foods and I'm hearing things. It's not common, not common like that. So that's a phenomenon known as synesthesia. So good question. Other questions? Other theories of sound? Those are the 3 that I teach. There could be other ones, but those are the ones that I don't know of any offhand. Maybe there's a newer one that I'm not aware of, but as far as I know, those are the 3 that I teach, and those are the 3 that, as I know, many teachers just teach place and frequency, and don't even bother with the traveling wave theory or volley theory. But I teach that too. So those are the 3 I know. But again, there could be something else too. So I will, in a way, punt on that. Maybe there are other ones, but not that I'm aware of. I mean, is it possible that they could, on the AP exam, give you something like this here and say, they give you an arrow and say, what is this? It is fair game. However, I guarantee you they'll use a picture that's a lot clearer than this one here. So it's not quite as intimidating as the brain, I would say, not quite as many things to know. So, all right. So with that, folks,